Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Ava sat by the window at Harbor Lane, watching the late afternoon light slide across Maplewood Street. She liked this spot because she could see the door, the street, and the alley at once. It made things simple. She ordered black coffee, nothing fancy, and let the routine settle her. People in Redwood Junction moved slow, polite, the kind of small-town rhythm that didn't expect anything sudden. That calm was exactly why Ava kept an eye on everything. Old habits don't leave you just because you hang up a uniform. She wasn't trying to stand out. Her jacket was plain, her messenger bag looked ordinary. But there was a way she carried herself that read different to those who knew the signs: quiet, measured, aware. Lily, the barista, tossed a glance her way and smiled without really seeing. Harold, on the bench outside, read his paper and hummed to himself. The town felt like a photograph, still enough to notice if someone moved wrong. The SUV showed up a block down, a black shape that didn't quite fit. It idled too long. A driver sat too still. Ava didn't look alarmed, she catalogued. The world had a way of telling you what it was about to do if you paid attention. She finished the last of her coffee and stood, casual, like anyone leaving a shop. The men who walked across the street seemed ordinary at first, 3 guys, hands in pockets, jackets pulled up. But their steps were matched, not random. Coordinated. Ava moved toward her car 2 blocks away, slow, deliberate. She kept the street in sight. The SUV rolled, then parked where it could watch the shop. One of the men paused at the curb and adjusted something under his jacket. A pistol, from the angle of his arm. The way he did it was clumsy, but practiced enough. They believed in a simple plan: show force, get what they wanted, leave. They thought a woman with a bag would hand over a wallet and walk away terrified. They did not know Ava. She let them close the distance, let them believe they had the advantage. That's how you learn the edges of someone's game, by watching the tiny tells. The tallest man, who later became known as Derek, kept his chin up like a leader, confident in the fear he expected to see. The others followed his rhythm, a pair of shadows trying to play dangerous. Ava's hands never moved suddenly. Her breathing stayed steady. She watched their feet, the way their weight shifted, how the second one glanced down the alley like he expected a lookout. This town had no idea something was about to break its easy pace. Ava did, and she was ready to do what she had always done: read, wait, and act only when the moment was right. The tallest man closed the gap and the gun pressed against Ava's temple with a casual brutality that assumed surrender. For a heartbeat the town blurred around the edges and she felt more present than ever, each breath, each micromotion amplified. The gunman expected panic, he expected her to bend. Instead she catalogued: the angle of his weight, the slack in his shoulder, the way the second man's eyes kept flicking toward the alley as if waiting for a signal. Wallet, he hissed, voice low and brittle. The other 2 moved like shadows, blocking any easy exit, believing force would do the rest. They had rehearsed this role in their heads. They hadn't rehearsed someone who refused to play along. Ava kept her face blank, let their arrogance swell. When people believe the story they've written, they stop seeing what's really happening. Her fingers drifted to the zipper of her bag, not to find a weapon, she carried none, but to check weight and balance, to feel how her center sat against the world. Training had taught her leverage more than it taught her violence. She watched for tiny tells: a pulse at the wrist, the drift of a foot, the twitch that told you a trigger finger wasn't locked. Those small, human things were invitations if you knew how to read them. A soda can clattered out of a nearby trash bin and rolled like a landed coin. Heads turned. Derek blinked. That tiny break in attention was her opening. Her movement was surgical, not loud, a smooth redirection of space. With her hand she nudged the gun barrel just enough to throw his stance off using his own forward momentum. He stumbled. The barrel turned inward away from her head by an inch that meant everything. The man's confidence hiccuped into surprise. Panic spread to the others like a contagion. The second lunged, clumsy, trying to recover dominance. Ava pivoted and used his motion against him, shepherding his momentum so that instead of cracking into her, he found himself unbalanced. The third tried to bolt toward the SUV, but Ava's foot placement closed the gap, her body a precise wedge. It wasn't brute force, it was physics and timing and an intimate knowledge of how people move when they're afraid. Onlookers froze or pulled out phones, the quiet town suddenly loud with the small sounds of startled attention. Through it all Ava kept control, hands gentle when needed, firm when required. She didn't want more harm than necessary. Her goal was containment and safe resolution. In seconds that felt like minutes, the three men lay sprawled or crouched, breathing hard, their bravado rinsed away. They obeyed when she said, "Stay down. Don't move." Fear makes obedience simple. Sirens were a distant threat at first, then grew louder as someone called it in. Ava positioned herself between the suspects and the crowd, scanning for anything else, an accomplice, a second vehicle, a hidden weapon. She did not lower her guard because danger has a way of hiding in ordinary places. Officer Logan's cruiser rolled up with lights cutting the light into shards. He moved with the calm of someone used to stepping into chaos and making it manageable. Officer Mia followed with the radio in her hand, eyes sweeping, protective and precise. She gave them a short, factual briefing, what she'd seen, the SUV, how the men had moved. No drama, only facts. That was her language, clear and concise, the kind of report that made follow-up easier. They secured the area, cuffed the felons, and thanked her with a mix of relief and disbelief. People murmured and whispered, some clapped softly, others just stared as if they had watched something they couldn't fully process. A shaky video began its life online, a clip that would ripple beyond Redwood Junction by nightfall. When the adrenaline ebbed, Ava stepped to the edge of the crowd and let the ordinary noise swallow her. Harold gave a trembling nod from his bench. Lily hovered at the coffeehouse door, hands still dusted with flour, eyes wide. The town's hush stretched into a buzz as neighbors clustered to swap versions. For many, the story stopped at the heroism they had seen. For Ava, it had only begun. She replayed the scene mentally like a post-operation review. Small errors by the men had been windows she exploited. But she couldn't shake the SUV, a detail that refused to be neutral. The sticker on the bumper, the scuff on the rear tire, the faint smell of diesel. Those weren't random. The coordination, the way they moved together, the brief glance down the alley before they acted, someone had organized them or at least given them a simple instruction set. That nagging suggestion of planning pulled at her instincts. She watched the police load the men into the rear of the cruiser and felt the old current of tension ripple in her chest. Someone had tried to force an outcome in her life and failed. That failure didn't erase the question of why they tried in the first place. Was it a test? A message? Or the start of something larger? She considered walking away, letting law enforcement carry the thread, but her sense of unfinished business tightened like a knot. Loose ends had a way of tangling into trouble later. Ava collected her things slowly, letting the town's attention rest somewhere away from her. She could be anonymous again if she chose. But as she took a step toward the SUV, the micro-details called to her, the boot print at an odd angle, a scrape on the bumper that suggested a hurried approach, a smudge that might be paint from another town. Casual criminal behavior rarely left that kind of pattern. She crouched for a closer look and felt, for the first time since she'd left service, the cold stir of a deeper problem forming at the edges of a small-town afternoon pushed Ava into motion she hadn't planned on. She crouched by the SUV, fingers tracing the scuff in the paint as if reading a map. The scrape ran at an angle that suggested a hurried turn, a panic exit, not a practiced getaway. The bumper sticker was half peeled, letters rubbed off, but she could make out part of a logo that didn't belong in Redwood Junction. It was a breadcrumb, and breadcrumbs in her line of work were never random. She watched the men in the cruiser, chest heaving, eyes hollow with the sudden comprehension that things had gone sideways. Derek kept his jaw tight, staring at nothing. Kyle held his arm like it hurt, though the break was mostly pride. Ricky sat slumped, breathing shallow through a face that still held the adrenaline fog. Officers moved methodically now, questions, photos, a block taped off for the forensics truck someone would call later. People whispered, offered statements, tried to turn a moment of shock into a story they could carry home. Ava, though, felt the horizon shift. Small-town robberies didn't ride in on fingerprints from another county. She left the scene before the formalities dragged her into tape and interviews and a column of local praise that would stretch further than she wanted. Moving through Pineview Plaza, she kept to the shadows of storefront awnings and let the afternoon press around her like a cloak. She didn't want to be noticed, not yet. But she also couldn't pretend the idea of coordination wasn't a problem. If someone had sent these men, if they'd been briefed, given a look, told to test a boundary, then Redwood Junction might be the first stop, not the only one. Over the next days she pieced together small things that, alone, meant nothing. A delivery van that passed through town at an odd hour. A gas receipt found in the trash with a different county's stamp. A ledger page someone tried to rip but didn't finish tearing. Each scrap suggested a network, not professional, not military, but organized enough to plan a quick, confident hit and then disappear. That level of organization worried her more than a clumsy robbery. It suggested someone watching, learning patterns, noting routines, someone who believed a small town was predictable. She started to talk to people without letting them know why. Lily served her another coffee. This time Ava asked what regulars came through, who worked late, who left early. Harold mentioned a pair of delivery trucks that had started showing up a few weeks ago, crates marked with a brand he didn't recognize. Officer Logan listened when she casually mentioned the bumper, and he didn't scoff. He gave a professional nod and alerted dispatch to flag traffic cams on the highways feeding into town. It was the kind of quiet cooperation that mattered. At night Ava went over and over the encounter in her head, not because she wanted to relive it, but because patterns emerge in repetition. She replayed Derek's stance, the way he looked at the alley, the subtle hesitation before they moved. Hesitation means a handler, or nerves, both useful. She thought about motive. Was it purely financial? A test of force? Or a signal, someone proclaiming they could pull a thread and watch what unraveled? Her days became surveys, little walks that felt like recon, watching for repeat drivers, checking the usual routes, noting who left town at odd hours. Her neighbors started seeing her more often, nodding, asking if she was okay. Ava gave small answers. She didn't want to frighten them, but she couldn't ignore the pressure building at the town's edge. The reality was clear, someone had tried to put fear into Redwood Junction, and they'd chosen the wrong woman to try it on. That thought gave her a resolve that was quiet and hard, like steel cooled in water. As she dug deeper, she found two things that tightened the knot. First, a local store owner told her a man had called in a fake delivery the week before, asking if the owner's usual routine could be delayed by 10 minutes. Second, a security camera from a gas station captured a face, partially obscured, hood up, but a distinctive limp. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. Ava pinned the grainy frame to the board in her head and matched it to the way Derek favored one side when he stumbled. It wasn't definitive. It was a place to start. The lines of the problem were now clearer, someone running small tests, mapping responses, and gathering data. It was not a random act of violence or greed. It was deliberate. That realization shifted everything from a one-off incident to a small war of information. Ava knew there would be choices ahead, how far to pull at the thread, when to involve more people, and how to keep the town out of the crossfire. She also knew that ignoring it was not an option. The next moves would define whether Redwood Junction stayed a sleepy picture or became a target worth watching. Ava decided she wouldn't wait and let other people react to her life. She set a plan that was not fancy, simple, honest, the kind of trap that relied on mistakes and expectation. If they were testing routes and routines, she'd give them a routine to test. She told Officer Logan only enough to make sure backup could be nearby without drawing attention, 2 cars parked out of sight, radios on, officers told to watch but not to intervene unless things escalated. She didn't want a parade, she wanted control. She used the coffee shop as her bait. Ava sat where she could see Maplewood Street and the alley. She left her bag visible, keys on the table, an open newspaper to look casual. The town moved in circles around her like it always did, Lily wiping down counters, Harold humming, a couple walking their dog. The SUV showed up again, this time a careful inching arrival that said they'd learned a little from the first attempt. Derek stepped out with the same cold certainty, like a man following a script. Kyle and Ricky flanked him, eyes sharp, jittery. The look on Derek's face said he expected the same easy result. They closed like they did before, slower now, testing. Derek reached for the gun. Ava let him press it to her temple for a heartbeat. It was theater, just long enough to test him, not to scare him. She kept her face blank and let the small-town sounds fill the space, the normalcy a counterpoint to the danger. Her only thought was timing. Then she acted. This time, Derek didn't make the same mechanical mistake. He was tighter, more careful, and the moment to redirect the barrel wasn't as wide. Ava felt that difference instantly. She adjusted, shifted her weight, brought her own motion into his, and used his tightened posture against him. It was a push and redirect, small, precise, the kind of move that turned aggression back onto itself. The gun came loose in his hand and skittered across the pavement. For a moment the world narrowed to 3 figures inhaling and a metal can clattering on asphalt. But the complication came from a car door slamming further down the street and a second set of feet moving out of sight. Her head snapped toward the noise and she saw a shadow moving behind the SUV, someone else. Not their usual clumsy trio, this one walked with purpose and control. The plan had been more than a test. It was bait for a handler or for a backup that would turn the situation into a bigger play. Ava's pulse quickened. She had planned for 3 and a scuff on a bumper. She had not planned for a 4th pair of hands closing in. Adrenaline sharpened her senses. She used Derek's momentum to shove him toward the curb and then pivoted to watch the shadow. Kyle surged up from where he'd been shoved, lunging with panic. Ricky tried to scramble for the SUV keys. Ava met them with the kind of calm that comes from doing things until they are second nature. She closed distance, stepped inside the arc of Kyle's motion, and used his sweep to bring him off balance. She didn't want to break bones, she wanted movement stopped and choices limited. Then the handler revealed himself, taller, calm, and with eyes that didn't belong to local boys. He moved like a man who understood consequence. He carried a different kind of threat, a pocket radio, a compact handgun tucked at his hip, a whisper of coordination that made his presence mean this had been set by someone with resources. The town had been a test ground. That single fact changed everything. If someone outside was pushing, they would escalate if given the chance. A quick exchange followed that felt too loud and too slow. The handler barked orders into his radio. Derek hesitated, torn between authority and the shock of being outplayed. That instant of hesitation was all Ava needed. She disarmed Derek with a twist taught by habit and shoved him down into the gutter. She turned to the handler with controlled heat in her voice and told him, "Leave. Now." He smiled like he thought smiles could bargain. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, soft as a threat. "I know enough," Ava replied. "And I know this town isn't the place you want to start things." Her words did not bluff. They carried the weight of someone who had seen how small sparks could become fires. The handler weighed options. On one side, his plan still had pieces that could work if he called for more. On the other, his men were scattered and a crowd was gathering. He looked at the cruiser lights cutting across the street and saw officers closing in. He made a choice. For the first time that afternoon, a disciplined heartbeat of decision carved the air. He signaled to back off. They melted back into the SUV like shadows pulling away from light. The handler slipped into the driver's seat with the kind of mechanical professionalism that said this wasn't his first hurry. Wheels squealed, and the vehicle vanished down Maplewood like someone erasing a mistake. Ava stayed where she was, chest heaving, every muscle still primed for motion. The officers moved in, cuffed the three on the ground, and radioed it all in. Officer Logan's hand found her shoulder in a brief, steadying grip. The aftermath settled with an odd weight. They had stopped the immediate threat, but what left a colder aftertaste was the certainty that the handler's withdrawal wasn't surrender, it was a recalculation. They had been tested, repelled, and marked as a place to watch. Ava let herself breathe and watched the SUV's dust settle on the horizon. The real danger wasn't over. It had simply shifted shape. In the quiet that followed the SUV's dust, Ava found herself walking the perimeter of what had happened like a surgeon inspecting an incision. The town was alive with whispers, but beneath it all was a low hum of calculation, hers and, she suspected, someone else's. Officer Logan and Officer Mia did their rounds, took statements, and coordinated a visible presence, but Ava felt the weight of what a withdrawal meant. A retreat wasn't always defeat. Sometimes it was a regroup, a change of tempo. That thought lodged in her like a splinter. Over the next 24 hours, Redwood Junction changed in small, almost indiscernible ways. Cameras that had been offline suddenly pinged. Patrols increased at shift changes. The coffee shop saw more people than usual, some because they were curious, others because they were wary. Ava kept to routines to avoid drawing suspicion, but she also widened her net. She reread the grainy footage from the gas station, leaned into logs from the delivery drivers who'd shown up at odd hours, and compared unit numbers on the truck's registration plates. Patterns emerged not as clean lines but as threads of repetition. The handler's method had been clinical: test, gauge, withdraw. That meant they were mapping vulnerabilities, not hunting for a quick score. Someone out there treated towns like projects and people like variables. Once you understood that, the whole thing stopped being local and went regional. Ava began to reach out quietly to contacts who owed favors or had questions that needed answers. It wasn't about drawing reinforcements, it was about triangulation, finding the origin of the pattern and seeing who fed it. People noticed her looking, but they didn't ask too many questions. In a place like Redwood Junction, where neighbors still borrowed sugar and returned it the same afternoon, a woman asking too many questions made people uncomfortable. Lily worried visibly when Ava lingered at the counter. Harold offered coffee and a story to distract her. Officer Logan texted updates and asked if she wanted to go to the station to give more details. Ava declined. She trusted the officers, but she also knew how fast local gossip could leak into unhelpful ears. She wanted a controlled approach. 3 days after the incident, a new pattern emerged that tightened her jaw. A local contractor reported missing tools from a locked worksite and a delivery manifest surfaced showing a series of crates moved through a nearby county. The manifests were small, bureaucratic things: dates, weights, signatures. But when she layered them over the timestamps from a tollbooth camera and the partial plate numbers she'd scribbled, a route formed like a dotted line across a map: inbound at odd hours, outbound before dawn, always through junctions where traffic thinned. It was not a single criminal, it was a route, a supply line. Ava started to set traps of her own, less dramatic than the day on Maplewood but just as deliberate. She let word leak, carefully, that a valuable display item at a store would be left out one night, that a delivery would be delayed, that a contractor might sleep on site. The kind of rumors that catch the attention of small-timers and the kind of bluster that makes handlers test boundaries. She wasn't looking to bait a gunfight. She wanted to see who would bite and how they would move. The idea was to force an answer. When the first crate failed to leave on schedule, the handler moved from testing to action. This time, though, the people who came were hesitant, more professional than Derek and his crew. They moved like men who'd been told to behave with care: entry, reconnaissance, exit. Ava watched from shadowed windows and counted boots, listening for accents, for the rhythm of their speech, for the smell of diesel that clung to their jackets. She could place them not by face but by the way they handled each other, the quiet protocols that spoke of a chain above them. The confrontation that followed was quieter than Maplewood's fight but sharper in purpose. She coordinated with Officer Logan to time a patrol stagger that would be noticed but not overt. When the men tried to move the crate, a single squad car rolled past with lights off and an officer inside watching. The men froze like fish on a line. They checked each other's eyes the way people check weather before a storm, looking to see if someone else would call the bluff. No one did. They retreated, leaving the crate untouched. What settled then was not relief but a slow understanding that the opposition respected surveillance and withdrawal more than they respected risk. The handler was learning, too. He adjusted his tempo and tactics. He sent fewer direct hands and more indirect signals, calls to small-time operators, mistaken deliveries, a seed of fear that could be watered carefully. Ava knew escalation was inevitable if he thought he could find a soft spot. Her next choices would need to be surgical, gather proof, expose the ringers, and ensure that law enforcement could move without warning the handlers. In the aftermath of the failed crate theft, people in town began to breathe easier, and yet the edges of their comfort remained frayed. Ava kept walking, kept looking, and kept pulling quiet threads. Each small victory taught her that control could be maintained without spectacle, that containment was sometimes about patience and the steady layering of proof. She also realized that solving this required more than muscle or instinct, it required strategy, allies, and a plan to cut off the supply routes that made the handler confident. By the end of the week, Ava had enough to sketch a probable origin and a list of likely accomplices. She shared the outline with Officer Logan in a quiet hallway of the station, not to take credit, but to make sure the next steps happened under official cover. He read the notes and nodded, the kind of nod that meant he understood the risk and the need for discretion. They agreed on a plan that would not be visible to the public, covert checks on the supply line, data pulls from county cameras, quiet interviews that wouldn't spook locals. Ava left the station feeling the pressure ease by a fraction. The map in her head was clearer, and her role in the town was no longer an isolated reaction but part of a coordinated effort. The tension that had once been a sharp flare was now a low, constant burn, manageable if kept contained. She knew the handler would watch how the town moved next and calibrate his responses. So would she. The balance had shifted once more, and now the game was to keep it that way until law enforcement could break the chain. Ava watched from the margins as Officer Logan and his contacts quietly tightened the net. They coordinated raids on storage units, cross-referenced manifests, and pulled toll records that lined up with the dotted route she'd sketched in her head. It was careful work, boring on paper, decisive in reality. The handler's supply line didn't disappear overnight, but cracks appeared where the pattern had been strongest. The operation moved in phases. First came surveillance, plainclothes officers in rented trucks, cameras set on dark lots, and stakeouts that lasted through cold nights. Ava helped where she could without stepping into the spotlight, passing along a poorly worded receipt, pointing out a fake contractor's logo, confirming timing windows. Officer Mia ran the logistics with a competence that matched Ava's edge. She knew how to follow paper trails and listen to the small tells that made criminals slip. Together with Logan, they built a mosaic of evidence that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The second phase was interruption. Teams moved on storage sheds at dawn, catching men who still believed they could work the morning routes. One by one, crates were opened to reveal a jumble of stolen goods, electronics, construction tools, odd parts that made little sense until catalogued. Fingerprints and registrations tied back to shell companies and a small freight broker out of county. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. The handler tried to reroute shipments, but law enforcement had already set up checkpoints on likely corridors. The handler's men panicked. They made mistakes big enough to be traced. On the day the handler was taken, it felt quieter than Ava expected. They found him in a motel 2 counties over, moving through his phone like a man finally exhausted by his own complexity. He didn't go down without a line of excuses. Men like him always have stories ready. The evidence stacked in the cases, manifests, transfer logs, witness statements, made those stories thin. Officer Logan read him his rights with a calm that kept the scene from exploding into spectacle. Ava watched from the doorway as a handcuffed figure realized the map he'd been drawing for years had been redrawn by people who would not be intimidated. Back in Redwood Junction, the ripple effects settled slowly. Derek, Kyle, and Ricky faced charges that matched their actions. Some pleaded, some didn't. The court dates, the paperwork, the sentences, these things are steady and unromantic, but they carry weight. The town watched the legal machinery turn, and in doing so it learned something about consequences. The men who had thought they could pull a string and walk away found themselves in places they hadn't planned for. Ava didn't seek interviews. Local reporters tried to coax statements, neighbors offered thanks in small gestures. Harold left a pie on her steps. Lily printed a simple sign in the coffee shop window, "Thank you." Officer Logan and Officer Mia kept in touch, exchanging nods and a kind of silence that means trust. The town's cameras stayed live a while longer, patrols kept steady, and people talked about watching out for one another with a seriousness that felt less like fear and more like care. In the quiet that followed, Ava walked Maplewood one evening and felt the town's rhythm return. There were no headlines calling her a hero, no parades, only a few nods from people who now knew to smile with recognition rather than surprise. She liked it that way. The job that had been thrust on her was done, not because she wanted credit, but because she understood a simple truth: preparedness is a practice, not a performance. Before she left Redwood Junction for good, she stopped by Harbor Lane and sat at her usual table. Lily brought a coffee without asking. Harold waved from his bench. Officer Mia walked in, gave a quick, friendly salute, and sat for 2 minutes to talk about less serious things: a fishing license, the town fair, a recipe for a stew. They shared small talk that felt like sutures, repairing the fabric of a place that had been tested. Ava stood to leave and looked down Maplewood Street. The scars of the weeks would fade, but the lessons would stick. People would be more watchful, not paranoid, just present. She tucked her bag over her shoulder and walked away light enough to enjoy the silence, heavy enough to remember. If danger came again, she knew how the town would respond: quietly, together, and without spectacle. That was the victory she valued most.